I'm very happy to see you. We're starting the third exciting day of the conference. And we start with the presentation with a key lecture, by Christian Welzel. He's going to speak about the topic that I suspect painfully refers also to Poland. Democracy misunderstood, authoritarian notions of democracy around the globe.
Thank you, Gosha. Indeed, I'm talking about this rather strange phenomenon about authoritarian notions of democracy, which sounds like a contradiction in itself, but it is, as you will see, it's very real. So this exists, and it's much more widespread than political scientists in the Western world might wish. Well, we have now almost 30 years of cross-national evidence from mass opinion polls and surveys about regime preferences, public support for democracy. So these kinds of questions are asked in the International Social Survey Program, in the European Values Study, in the World Values Survey, in the Latino Barometer, the Afro Barometer, the Asia Barometer, the Arab Barometer, and other surveys. So political scientists mostly, of course, are interested in how widespread is support for democracy in a given country, how is it changing over time, and stuff like this. Apparently, the driving assumption behind asking these questions is that they give us insight into legitimacy questions. Yeah? So apparently the assumption is that, and you saw this written very often, for instance, by Schmitter and O'Donnell or Linz and Stepan, you would find like sentences saying like democracy can only survive if a big majority of the public consider it is, quote, the only game in town. So from that point of view, you do want to know how widespread in a given country is support for democracy as a political system. So it's about regime preference. Apparently as well, we also asking these questions in countries that obviously are not so democratic. So we're doing surveys in Saudi Arabia, in China, and in other authoritarian or semi-authoritarian systems, and we're still asking about regime preferences. So asking for support for democracy in comparison to alternative types of regime. And obviously, we believe that we can get an insight into a regime's legitimacy if we know the regime preferences. So for example, when we find that in an authoritarian system, 80 or 90% of the public says, and we find this, for instance, in Pakistan or in Bangladesh, so a huge majority of the public says that they support or prefer democracy before any other political regime, you would think that this tells us the current regime is illegitimate and a transition to democracy would work if we just remove the bandits that are in power and keep people from having a voice. This approach actually was informing US foreign policy strategies in Iraq and Afghanistan. The initial assumption was, yeah, we know from surveys that people support freedoms, people support democracy, so the only thing you have to do is to impose a democratic constitution and remove the authoritarian elites, and then this country, this society will develop into a democratic direction. You would have seen this also in the first initial comments on the Arab Spring, which was branded in much of the Western media as a democracy movement. Not so many people would label it that right now anymore. And unfortunately, even though, especially countries like Egypt or Libya, where we also measure like 90% of the public says they support democracy, they prefer to alternative types of regime, we did not observe that the Arab Spring moved into like a continuation of Hunning's third wave of democratization. And in fact, we see in many places a resilience or a resurgence of authoritarian tendencies. Yeah? Erdogan, Poland, or Viktor Orban in Hungary and other places where we observe these tendencies. So we have this puzzle that support for democracy is really apparently very widespread, but it can easily coexist with the very absence of democracy or serious deficiencies in democratic standards. Yeah? And that's kind of a puzzle, at least from the political culture approach. So unless you think that mass preferences do not matter for the type of regime that a country has and governs, unless you think that way, it's really a puzzle that you have this strange coexistence, really widespread support for democracy with the absence or deficiencies in democracy. Because of that puzzle, scholars started to take a different look at things, and first suspicions were arising that when we measure that 75% of the Saudi population says and would like to have democracy, or the Iraqi population says the same thing, or a huge majority of Jordanians, Bangladeshis, Pakistanis say these things, maybe there is a different notion of democracy that is not the same as Western liberal political science textbook definition would say what democracy is. So there might be twisted, false notions, so to speak, and when they prevail, people might consider a country as democratic, even though it is not. And that would solve the puzzle, because people would then see, for instance, in China, would see their, or consider their society as democratic, even though it is not. But then you have then it's no longer a contradiction that mass support for democracy can coexist with its absence if the notion of democracy is different. So political scientists particularly delved into, or designed new questions where the audience was not only asked about how strongly they support democracy, they were also asked about, like, what does democracy mean? The Afrobarometer was one of the first survey projects that did that, and they also did it in the beginning, at least, in an open question format. So we're just asking people, what do you think about what is democracy? And then people could just speak, and they tape recorded these things, and then they coded those open-ended answers. And it turned out, Mattis and Breton have published on that, it turned out that most people would say, yeah, it's about free and fair elections, it's about civil rights, it's about freedoms and these kinds of things. So that looked really comforting, because many people would say these things that indeed you would find in a textbook definition of democracy. The European Social Survey also has a battery of questions where they ask, but this is a closed-ended format, so they have a battery and there's 10 or 12 items, and each item addresses a particular meaning of democracy, like separation of powers, independent judiciary, multi-party system, organizational pluralism, human rights, competitive elections, all these kinds of things. And yeah, and then you could see what are the primary, the most important notions that find most support by the people. The problem with this ESS battery format was they only took in items that definitely belong to the definition of democracy, and the only thing you can see is you can differentiate which of the definitional elements are more strongly anchored in people's mindset. But you could not find out if someone has a wrong notion of democracy, because you have no items that phrase a wrong notion for which people could express support. And this is what we did in the World Value Survey the first time in Wave 5, and we repeated that in Wave 6. And we have devised this question format here. So the entry statement says, quote, many things are desirable, but not all of them are essential characteristics of democracy. Please tell me for each of the following things how essential you think it is as a characteristic of democracy, and then comes a 10-point scale. Use the scale where 1 means not at all an essential characteristic of democracy, and 10 means it definitely is an essential characteristic of democracy. And then we got this much better. We got these 10 statements here. So the one says, government's tax duration subsidize the poor. You will easily see that these 10 items are designed in a way or supposedly addressing 3 different notions of democracy. You see here government's tax the rich and subsidize the poor. This should probably go together with people receive state aid for unemployment, or the state makes people's incomes equal. So there is 3 of these statements are addressing a kind of a social notion of democracy where redistributive justice is the theme that is addressed here. Then there's a couple of items which are at the core of what democracy really means from a political science point of view, like people choose their leaders in free elections, civil rights protect people from state oppression, and women have the same rights as men, right? So I guess political scientists would agree that these are the things that really condense the meaning of democracy very accurately. Now, thinking about the Islamic world, thinking about countries that have a history of military intervention, and thinking about countries that have a history of populism, we've introduced 3 items that turn the meaning of democracy on its head in order to find out whether these meanings find public support. And these are the 3 ones that are in red here. Religious authorities ultimately interpret the laws. The army takes over when government is incompetent. And people obey their rulers. Yeah. I call this authoritarian notions of democracy, and what we did is that we created a summary index over those 3 items for each individual. So I measure for each individual how strong is the support of these 3 items taken together. Let me say here quite clearly, again, to link to our previous debates, this is a formative index, so I don't care whether this is converging in a latent construct. On a side note, however, these 3 things do correlate positively in each society, and they correlate negatively in each society with like civil rights and free elections. Yeah. So you have a relatively similar polarity in the correlation patterns in different countries. Nevertheless, we created a summary and those 3 items which we call authoritarian notions of democracy. The next slide shows the distribution over this index. I rescaled the number format into a range from minimum 0, so someone who scores on 0 in on the authoritarian notion of democracy has no authoritarian notion of democracy. So this person does not support any of these 3 items at all. And someone who is at 1 fully supports all 3 of those items. And this is the individual level data distribution that you see here. One comforting piece of information is that some of the highest bars are on the 0. So there is a lot of people who really reject this authoritarian notion of democracy. But you see, this is when you have a scale from minimum 0 to maximum 1.0, and you have a mean at 0.46, so it's almost in the middle of the scale, and you have pretty much of a bell shape here. The standard deviation is about half of the mean, so we have a variance coefficient of 0.5. So these distributional features suggest this is a worthwhile object of analyzing and explaining the variation that exists, both among individuals, but then also when we look at country averages. By the way, this little thing here is one country, and it's Egypt. You will see later. So Egypt has a mean and a median at 0.8 on that scale of authoritarian notions of democracy. This is interesting because 80% of the Egyptians, in another question of the world, say that having democracy is a very good idea, and they prefer it to alternative regimes. But 80%, you could say, of Egyptians have an authoritarian definition of what democracy means. So Sisi is not considered as so undemocratic, and the Muslim Brotherhood was voted into power. And you can imagine, if you think of the three items that define this authoritarian notion of democracy, the two ones that have the strongest support in Egypt is religious leaders ultimately interpret the laws. So this explains why the Muslim Brotherhood was voted into power, Morsi. And the other one that has very high support is that the military takes over when there is disorder, and so Sisi is in power. So people, if you like, you could say cynically, in some sense, people seem to get what they desire when it comes to political regimes. Now let's have a look at the country distribution. So how do countries, entire societies look on this index? So we're now looking at the population average on authoritarian notions of democracy and look at the country rating, the country rankings. And you see it here in descending order. So on top, we see the countries where the authoritarian notion is most pronounced, and at the bottom, you see the countries where it's least pronounced. The variation is from an average of 0.15 in Germany to an average of a little bit above 0.8 in Egypt. So this is we fill a really large space of the theoretically possible variability. If you look at countries at the top, you will immediately recognize similarities. Egypt, Pakistan, Yemen, Morocco, Qatar, Uzbekistan, Jordan, Malaysia, Libya, Rwanda. If you look at countries at the bottom, Germany, Sweden, Japan, Australia, Netherlands, South Korea, New Zealand, Slovenia, Taiwan, Hong Kong, the United States, you will also see similarities. And this is not an unfamiliar country ranking. So we have, on the one hand, we have countries that do not have a long democratic tradition, countries that are not very much developed economically speaking, not very prosperous, not very rich, and countries that have a certain religious tradition, like Islam, obviously, or on the other hand, you have countries that have a long democratic tradition, so mature democracies, post-industrial, highly developed knowledge societies, and mostly a Protestant religious history that defines the opposite poles on this scale. And then there's many countries that are sort of in between. Interestingly, just having a relatively long democratic tradition is apparently not the most important antidote against authoritarian notions of democracy, because if you look at where India is located, it has a pretty long bar. It's almost at 0.5 when it comes to authoritarian notions of democracy, and it has a long democratic tradition because India is democratic since its independence. All right. Now, so the simple eyeballing over the country ranking already gives us a couple of hypotheses. What explains that authoritarian notions of democracy are widespread in a given population? Now, you could now hypothesize it's about the religious legacy of a country. Whether a country is predominantly imprinted by the tradition of Protestantism or Christianity for the matter versus Islam and Orthodox Christianity. You could hypothesize its economic development or cognitive mobilization. So countries that are highly educated made it far progress into the knowledge society, where science and research and development and education and these kinds of things play a very important role. You could hypothesize that it's the democratic legacy that a country has accumulated over the recent decades. Yeah, you see mature democracies do not have such strong authoritarian notions of democracy as countries that don't have that democratic tradition. You could also think that maybe state repression is a factor, or indoctrination. So people are getting indoctrinated. There's hardly any country where the government would tell people we are undemocratic. We are not governing for the benefit of the people. Almost every government in the world claims that it governs for the benefit of the people and is democratic for that matter. Yeah? Even communist societies call themselves people's republics. So there's always that claim. So it might be understandable that people exposed to censorship and state media all the time just developing wrong notions of democracy because of that. Well, we have data, of course, for all these kinds of things, and the first thing we did, we looked at bivariate correlations. So what are the strongest correlates of a country's average on the authoritarian notion of democracy, and we tried to get indicators for these alternative possible explanations. And we see that in the next graph, many of the signs are negative, which is making sense because it means when that particular factor is strongly pronounced in a given society, it makes it less likely, or it diminishes authoritarian notions of democracy, and therefore we see negative correlations. So the knowledge society gives us the strongest, is a minus 0.75 correlation with the authoritarian notions of democracy. Knowledge society is an index I took from the World Bank. It's a composite measure that summarizes scientific output per capita, like patents per 1,000 inhabitants, amount of royalties per 1,000 inhabitants. So this is one measure, scientific output per capita. Another one is level of education. So it looks at like literacy rate, but also tertiary level enrollment ratios. So scientific output, widespread education, and the third component of the Knowledge Society Index is accessibility of communication and information technology, like internet hosts per 1,000 inhabitants, personal computers per 1,000 inhabitants, and these kinds of things. So these three indicators are summarized in this Knowledge Society Index. The next strongest one, almost on the same level, emancipative values. I'm not going to go into an explanation of that thing. But then our other things also seem to be important. Political violence is a measure that's called the political terror scale, which is based on Amnesty International and US State Department human rights violation reports, and they're coded every year for every country. And this has a positive correlation with authoritarian notions of democracy, suggesting that when there is more violence, also includes state repression and state terror and political imprisonment and these kinds of things. So when there's more political violence, it's more likely to find authoritarian notions of democracy to be widespread. And then there's one thing that relates directly to existential security theory. And that is, of course, also very strongly influenced or inspired by Ron's previous work. So the wave 6 of the World Value Survey had an interesting new question battery where people were asked how much they fear to fall victim of a violent crime or of being affected by civil war or by a war. So this is about immediate physical threat perceptions, and apparently physical threat perceptions favor authoritarian notions of democracy. Well, GDP per capita has a negative correlation. A democratic tradition, so here we took John Gehring et al.'s democracy stock index, which is an interesting variable. It measures, using the polity democracy autocracy scores, it looks at each country's performance over the last 100 years, so say from 1900 to 2000, and for each year, it just adds up the democracy score, and then you get an accumulation over time. So this is reflecting a country's accumulated experience, historic experience with democracy. The measure is even a little bit more sophisticated because they have introduced a 1% deflator. So countries that are farther back in the past, when you have a very good democracy score there, that counts less than when it is more recent. Yeah. So that's a quite sophisticated indicator to measure the democratic tradition. And that has a negative correlation, as you would assume, but not so strong. It's just 0.33. And that's not so strong. Then we have, we looked at, because you have seen there were a lot of Muslim majority societies on top of the list. But not all of them. So, and that also has a correlation, but it's also not so strong. It's positive, meaning that having a larger proportion of Muslims in a country makes authoritarian notions of democracy more widespread, but it's only a moderate correlation. Then we had a couple of other things we were looking at. Patrimonial state, we also labeled it, in the beginning we labeled it a rent-seeking economy. So this is basically Michael Ross's measure of the oil, gas per capita rent that the country is getting, because the idea here was that in these, you think of the Gulf monarchies, for instance, that these rent-seeking economies, patrimonial states, have patriarchal structures, have a long tradition of these structures, and it might be that there is a very strong socialization effect, that people then learn to see the political world through the lens of these experiences, and that should increase authoritarian notions of democracy. But it turned out not such a strong, there's actually no significant correlation. And then we also looked at, apart from religious denomination, we looked at the level of religiosity, because this might be the problem, and not the particular religious denomination. But also here was no significant correlation. Then some of you have followed recent debates, and Francesco is giving a presentation on that as well, with the duplicates. Recently we had a couple of papers out that were alarming the researchers about the problem of duplicate responses in the different samples that we have. And we looked at it, here we looked at the totally identical, not nearly identical, but completely identical responses, and we percentaged them per country. So our Indian surveys have up to 50% complete identicals, for example, and that's true for all of the waves we have in India. Because this could blur the picture, it could be a factor you might want to control for it, because you don't want to measure non-attitudes, right? And authoritarian notions of democracy is about attitudes that people have. The issue of non-attitudes also relates to, it goes back to Philip Converse, who published a famous chapter in 1964 on that issue. When people give contradictory responses, that might be an interviewee who is just not paying attention, who's just saying random stuff throughout the interview. And then you also would measure a non-attitude when you have an authoritarian notion of democracy. So we control for this as well. How did we do that? Well, with the duplicate responses, SPSS offers a tool right now where you can identify The duplicate cases, you can code them, and you can percentage them for the particular sample at hand. The contradictory responses, you could do it in different ways. What we did, we used two questions. One is at the very beginning of the questionnaire, where people are asked how important different life domains are. And it's on a 4-point Likert scale, a very important, a rather unimportant, or totally unimportant life domain. And one question asks how important is politics. Yeah? And then we have a question further down in the questionnaire that uses the same response format, again a 4-point scale, where people are asked how interested they are in politics. Yeah? Very interested, somewhat interested, fairly uninterested, not interested at all. Now, it happens that there are people who say politics is a very important life domain, and in the other question they say, I'm not at all interested in politics. Logically, this is compatible, but I think if you think about it, it's a contradictory response. So we looked in each sample how many people are giving contradictory answers of this kind, or vice versa. Yeah, you could also say politics is not at all important, and in the next question you say you're very interested in politics. So we looked in each sample how many people would give contradictory answers in that sense, and percentage them per sample. And the variation was between 2% of the people in Germany up to 45% of the people in Pakistan who would give such contradictory answers. Yeah, and then there's also the issue of missing responses, especially on these questions of authoritarian notions of democracy. Notions of democracy, we also percentage per country the proportion of non-given, of answers not given. This is also an issue because your percentage base changes when you take in missing values or leave out missing values. Yeah? Your average will be different on the authoritarian notion of democracy dependent variable. All right. Let's see some scattergrams, how countries distribute over these issues. So this is the physical, I call it physical threat in the previous table. Here it's called exterior threat, but it's this question, again, where we ask people how fearful they are of falling victim to a violent crime, to the consequences of civil war, or a terrorist attack, something like that. So this is the physical threat index. Again, it's scaled from 0 to 1.0. And you see the variation is from Tunisia to the Netherlands, where the fear is the lowest. Also Sweden falls in this category. And the highest fears we have in countries like Rwanda, Tunisia, Georgia. Egypt is an outlier again, you see that here. Well, there's a relatively clear tendency that as the fear of physical violence is increasing, authoritarian notions of democracy seem to be more strongly pronounced. Now we try to remember the two strongest correlates were the knowledge society and emancipative values. They were almost on a par with minus 0.75 and minus 0.74. And so we ran a regression to disentangle which of the two is driving the authoritarian notions of democracy. So we run a regression where authoritarian notions of democracy, the average per country is the dependent variable, and we introduce the average, population average and emancipative values, and the knowledge society indicator as predictors. And these are the two partial regression plots. And it's quite obvious that they look pretty similar. So emancipative values controlling for the knowledge society explain 23% of the variation. The knowledge society controlling for emancipative values explain 24% of the variation. So these are equally strong effects. They operate in the same fashion, which is obvious from the shape of the distribution. And if you look at how strongly these two factors are correlated, you can hardly disentangle them, because knowing where a country scores in the knowledge society gives you an 80% explanation of the emancipative values score. So there is a 0.9 correlation between these two indicators, which tells us, so to speak, they're basically measuring the same thing. And that's not so surprising from a theoretical point of view. If you go back to my concept of human empowerment, the knowledge society would, so to speak, be the economic, the socio-economic manifestation of human empowerment. And emancipative values would be the preferential manifestation of human empowerment. So these two indicators belong under the same roof concept, and under which perspective it totally makes sense. So we no longer look at them separately, but we summarize them. Yeah? And we summarize them into an indicator. You can now, thinking about labels, we simply call it the enlightenment ladder. So, meaning that when people are cognitively more mobilized, more into a knowledge society, more educated, more access to information, and more emancipatory in their preferences, remember what it all includes: tolerance, gender equality, people's voice, personal autonomy, equal opportunities, and these kinds of things. They are sort of enlightened. If you are at the low end, you are maybe endarkened rather than enlightened. So we call that summary indicator the enlightenment ladder. And that's what the enlightenment ladder does. It is a very powerful force in eliminating authoritarian notions of democracy. We have a very clear negative effect here: more enlightened, less authoritarian notions of democracy. Nevertheless, Egypt is still a pretty pronounced outlier in that consideration. The explained variance is 66%, so roughly 2/3 of the variation in authoritarian notions of democracy across the 60, 70 countries we have covered here is explained by where the societies are on the enlightenment ladder. Seeing this, now you know already, doing regression analysis is now just a game, because you know nothing will eliminate the force of this factor here, and this is what we actually also found. So the dependent variable is authoritarian notion of democracy at the country level, and we threw in a couple of the things. We threw in everything that was significant in the bivariate correlations. Yeah? And the enlightenment ladder, and you see this here, missing responses, is also slightly significant, but the enlightenment ladder is the decisive factor here in diminishing authoritarian notions of democracy. And Muslim dominance, not significant. Political violence, not significant. Democratic tradition, as surprising as this might be for political scientists, even using a very good, sophisticated, valid, reliable measure of the democratic tradition, completely insignificant, controlling for enlightenment ladder. And even physical threat perceptions do not matter once we know where a society is located on that very ladder. Well, some people now might argue, oh, this could all be like ecological fallacy, this might be like artifacts of aggregation. Of course, then the next step is a multi-level model, where now we also have individual level characteristics as predictors of authoritarian notions of democracy, and they all work in the expected direction. So the country level model is basically replicating what we saw in the country level regression. So we take in the percentage of missing responses, and we take in the enlightenment ladder, and you see this is extremely significant. This is the decisive factor. Sex is significant, slightly significant, and male-coded. So that means, because the effect is positive, males tend to have slightly higher, more authoritarian notions of democracy. Birth cohort, this is negative. This means if you are younger, you are less likely to have an authoritarian notion of democracy. The other factors that are significant: religiosity increases, so it's a positive sign. religiosity increases authoritarian notions of democracy. And then cognitive mobilization is measured as the person's level of education plus the diversity of information source usage. Right, didn't we say an hour? And yeah, and then we have emancipative values, which is negative, this is negative, and significant. And at the individual level, physical threat perceptions are significantly increasing the authoritarian notions of democracy. But I want you to pay attention to the size of the coefficients. They are directly comparable because all the variables are scaled in the same way from minimum 0 to maximum 1. Those coefficients are, even if they're significant, they're small. They make a small contribution. The decisive stuff plays at the country level. Country level conditions are important. They are important also as moderators of individual level effects. So the effect of emancipative values at the individual level is conditional on where the country is on the enlightenment ladder. So there is an additional negative, an additional subtraction from the authoritarian notions of democracy when a person is strong in emancipative values, and that person also lives in a society that is far advanced on the enlightenment ladder, that has an additional depressing effect on authoritarian notions of democracy. Also, the effect of cohort is contingent on where the society is on the enlightenment ladder, so it's a negative interaction. That means being younger has a stronger depressing effect on authoritarian notions of democracy if the country is more advanced on the enlightenment ladder. So this double underlines the importance of the enlightenment factor. It's important as a factor in and by itself because it creates a depressing effect on the average, so an intercept thing, but it's also important as a moderator of some of the individual level characteristics that turn out to be important. This is a visualization of one of the cross-level interactions. On the y-axis, we see the strength of the effect of emancipative values on authoritarian notions of democracy. You see, these are regression coefficients. Yeah? They are mostly negative, which means in most countries, individuals being more emancipatory will have less authoritarian notions of democracy, but the negativity is, so to speak, enforced when the country is more advanced on the enlightenment ladder. Then the negative effect of emancipative values, so depressing the authoritarian notions of democracy, is more pronounced. So this is a visualization of the interaction, the cross-level interaction we saw in the model before. Why is this important? I mean, we could also look at the enlightenment ladder here. We also find another strange phenomenon, and this is overrating. And this is also a paper I'm working on with Maria and a couple of other people. So the World Values Survey also asks the people, how democratic is your country on a scale from 1 to 10? And then you can match this information with what Freedom House says, how democratic the country is. And then you will find many countries with enormous mismatches, like China. Many people in China say their country is democratic. Freedom House says it's not. This is overrated. You can also have underrated. That is very widespread in the Netherlands, and Sweden, and Germany. So many people say my country is not so democratic. In fact, it is very democratic. Yeah, this is underrated. So this is being more critical. Overrating is actually the opposite. It's having a very uncritical view on the country's institutional performance. And I don't have a slide for that, but I could show you that this is influenced by emancipative values, but this effect is actually mediated by authoritarian notions of democracy. So where you have authoritarian notions of democracy, people overrate their country's democratic performance. And this is now very, very logical. When you think, like a Chinese thinks, democracy is having strong leaders. And then you are asked how democratic is your country, and your country has strong leaders, and you say it's very democratic. Yeah? And then the country does not have any legitimacy problem, and the evidence that we have from like mass support ratings for democracy do not tell us anything about the popularity of these regimes. And institutional overrating is also an important thing. You look at social movement activity, so these are protest data. It has a strongly depressing effect on social movement activity if you are an institutional overrater. So you are uncritical. It's also logical. If you are uncritical, why would you protest? Yeah. So in a sense, you could argue that these authoritarian notions of democracy, which feed uncritical ratings of a country's institutional reality, are a sedative, a tranquilizer of social movement activity. And of course, you won't expect in a weak civil society that there is pressure for democratization. It's actually the opposite. So when we pull these pieces together in a more conceptual manner, what we could say is that we have something like an authoritarian equilibrium. Lack of enlightenment, so lack of emancipative values, lack of a knowledge society, that leads to authoritarian notions of democracy. That leads to an uncritical reality estimation that weakens social movement activity, and that leads to deficient or even absent democracy, which in turn might feed back to this here. Because the authoritarian rulers usually have not strong interest in bringing the society forward or upward on the enlightenment ladder, because people might start to ask critical questions, which as an authoritarian leader you want to avoid. The opposite is, we also know now, the democratic equilibrium. It's all of that the same, but the opposite. Yeah? So plenty of enlightenment, liberal notions of democracy, critical reality estimation, strong social movement activity, and as a result of that, you get effective democracy. So what should we all hope for? We should just hope that the light shines on us. And so much for now. And I'm really curious to receive critical comments and questions.
I'm curious, unless I missed something, you didn't correlate the misunderstanding of democracy with gender equality attitudes. And I'm asking this in part because I did it for the Arab world, and I showed clearly that there is no correlation of democracy support and gender equality support there, and in fact only a very small group of educated people, who also tend to be older people, tend to support both democracy and gender equality in the Arab world. And in your own research, historically, you emphasize that lower fertility and gender equality attitude was so important in the early stages of the shift. And in this piece of research, it seems that men are more prone to misunderstand democracy in an authoritarian fashion than women. So it sort of invites the explicit correlation.
It's a good point. In fact, it's a pity I actually didn't mention that. We only used the gender subcomponent of emancipative values in this analysis. So your question is right on target. And this is actually what we did, because it's the strongest driver here. Next is the pro-choice stuff is also is the second most important here.
Fascinating, Chris, and part of your findings are no surprise, the emancipative values or the enlightenment ladder, which is with knowledge society. Being powerful is very powerful explanation, but not surprising. but it's a bit new and needs further digging into, I think, is the importance of the missing data. This is the other. The others are pretty insignificant, but missing data is a significant factor. You're not nearly as strong as the enlightenment ladder, but strong enough to evoke curiosity, and I'd like to dig into that farther. And one thing is that this is almost another indicator of the knowledge society. It is people who don't have opinions. This is usually like the low education, little information, etc. It's and yet, though it seems to be another indicator of the knowledge society, it is not wiped out by the fact that you do measure the knowledge society. And it could be some kind of, in addition to, for sure, less educated people are less opinionated, it could be an indicator of being afraid to have opinions or to express opinions, or something like that. So I don't know whether you have a right off the top of your head answer to this, but this is very interesting for me.
That's true, and unfortunately I don't have right out of the top answer to this because we have very limited means to investigate what is behind these missing values. But the fact that they give you additional traction in explaining the authoritarian notions of democracy might indicate that these are people who also have these notions but are not daring to tell them in the interview situation. But it's hard to prove that point.
By definition.
Yeah, it's hard to prove that point. But you're right. And we actually did not yet look into identifying those individuals with non-response and look in a very detailed way, like a profiling of their other attitudes. But that would be the next natural step to go in order to see whether there is something particular about their attitude and the profile that might give us additional hints.
What I like with education information is obvious and well known. And what makes it surprising is that it still has something there, which could be fear to express it.
Yeah, I agree.
Eric, please.
Great job, Chris. One question I think they should be in the world value surveys. Do you have the authoritarian measures in there?
Like what
About the notion of what your children should. And particularly since you're talking about authoritarianism, these are sort of the standard traditional measures. And I would suggest that that would be probably something that might work for you very well. In addition, I think there might be another issue about notions of the other. And we're seeing this, and if anyone wants to talk about this, I think either Ron or I could easily talk about what's going on in the United States right now, where we see a huge, surge, particularly within the Republican Party, for, I guess, there are several people who've shown that support for Trump rests upon authoritarianism. And we're seeing this, in the United States, which you might now want to reclassify higher up on your, closer to Egypt on that score. So I think the views of the other views of immigrants, views of trusting people who are different from yourself would be useful.
We don't have something like an authoritarianism scale because that would be an obvious candidate to throw into the equation. But in some sense, I thought, and the narrative of the paper actually introduces it that way, that emancipative values are kind of an inverse indicator of authoritarianism because it involves tolerance issues and equality issues and these kinds of things. We also tested it, if you decompose emancipative values, one component is child-raising attitudes, and there is the obedience issue, for instance, which in it by itself already also has an effect. But the gender equality things are more powerful as a component of emancipative values. I think notions of the other is a good idea. We didn't look into this yet, but I actually don't know why this didn't come up in my mind. Yeah, we could also look into like the outgroup trust measure that we have and the welcomingness to immigrants and things like that. Yeah, I think this is a good idea. I would expect to find some evidence
I
here.
don't know why, maybe it's lack of sleep, and I'm going blank, as to who came up with these authoritarian scales originally. Do you remember?
Well, it goes back to Adorno.
Adorno,
Yes,
that's
yes.
Adorno scales, yeah.
That's all.
And the whole idea has to do, you know, and I see this sometimes in the stuff I'm asked to review. It's all about children. They say, no, it's not. Children were just sort of the vehicle for expressing these authoritarian values that Adorno was talking about. And they actually work quite well in a number of them. I've used them, other people have used them. Mark Whittington has a whole book on it. And I think that may, you know, really sort of express some fundamental differences, particularly the search for order. And if you look at Egyptian society, that has been a huge element in there. And not only Egyptian society, but contemporary Turkish society, where 2,500 people have been sued for insulting President Erdogan.
Even Germans are now sued for that.
And, you know, in the United States, if they sued everyone who insulted Obama, half the country would be in jail.
And half of Congress.
Great, there were other questions. Alina?
Thank you very much for the great lecture. Actually, I got a question regarding the post-communist and particularly post-Soviet countries, because most of them turned out to be then authoritarian. I mean, like each of Ukraine is the exception, and actually, I mean, the authoritarian indices is working perfectly, I suppose, for Asia and for Africa, but it's not capturing. I mean, these countries are also particularly more or less secularized. There's some Islamization happening in some of them, but generally speaking, Kazakhstan, for example, or Tajikistan, Uzbekistan do have these streams of Islamization, but the authorities are non-religious, so they are secular. So at this point, I mean, you get Belarus and Ukraine being nearby. I mean, they are countries with rather different regimes, political regimes, and processes happening. And and then you've got then Russia near China, or Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan are being very nearby, but in Kyrgyzstan the political situation was less stable, or for example Russia and Kazakhstan are still different. But for only the percentages, and elections are very close by, but nevertheless.
So what is your question?
My question would be actually, how to capture that, whether it is possible to capture that for post-communist countries. I mean, it's pretty the is then maybe something more might have been helpful.
So your point is that we don't measure the authoritarian notions in these countries, or?
For example, I don't know, maybe just like military or religious factors are not working in this, I suppose, in the post-Soviet countries.
If you look where they are on the list here, let's see, when we go down the list, Uzbekistan is the first one appearing. So this is really strong with authoritarian notions of democracy. Armenia, Russia is also on the upper third. So I do think they are approximately where they are considering their regime deficiencies when we talk about deficiencies of democracy. So I think they are not a particular outlier in any sense of the picture. What we did not show here, of course, is, and there are differences, because the notions index is built on 3 components, and the mixture of these components can look different in different groups of countries. As Edward already hinted to, in the Islamic world, the religious factor is important. In Latin America, the military factor is important. In many of the post-Soviet societies, it's the people obey the rulers kind of thing, strong leader idea that is driving them towards a more authoritarian version of democracy.
Was Rebecca waiting?
The mic is disappeared, so.
Yeah.
Okay, so I really, thanks for the presentation. I really enjoyed this and I found this very exciting research and it's a topic that I'm very interested in. My question really actually concerns whether you considered maybe, and it's actually something I rarely suggest, but whether you considered maybe adding a slightly more qualitative component to this. Because I really strongly feel that there has to be some need for understanding here. We can't just assume that somebody who gives an apparently contradictory response is just unenlightened or stupid. I think that if I was a secular liberal living in Turkey right now, I'd be quite enthusiastic about the idea that the army should take over. And this is not just unique to Turkey. I mean, in many countries, the military has played a role of constitutional protector, whether secularism in the case of Turkey. In Pakistan, where the military is seen as relatively clean relative to civilian politicians. And so having the threat of military intervention is actually seen as something that actually can help democratic stability in the absence of the courts doing that. Because the legal framework should be the agency part of that. So as part of it is the need for there needs to be a contextual understanding. I was also thinking whether or not really there should be two axes here, not one. So one axis is people's enthusiasm for a participative notion of democracy. And those items are in the survey. And the other one is the extent to which people feel that certain things should be removed from the sphere of democratic contestation, which I guess moves into the domain of authoritarian democracy. Because I can imagine you can have people in all four spaces on this quadrant. So I know people, only one or two in Egypt, who support the Muslim Brotherhood. And they are very enthusiastic about democracy. They believe in civic debate, they believe in civic participation, they engage in protests, they want to have elections. Unlike the older generation. But if you ask them about the role of religious authorities in interpreting the law, they might put 9 or 10. So they believe that certain things should be removed from the sphere of democratic contestation. But they're still very enthusiastic about democracy. And probably in a different sign of the construct, we might find that for Western societies as well. So I'm sure there's plenty of people in Western societies who believe that social rights should be enshrined in the Constitution, for example, which is the case in India or South Africa. Social rights are constitutionally enshrined, so they're removed from the sphere of democratic debate. Likewise, I mean, if you ask the United States, should the Supreme Court be able to, or how essential is it for democracy the Supreme Court strike down popularly approved law? Well, a lot of people will support that because, again, there are a notion that certain core protections should be removed from potential override by populist politicians. So I think there are these two axes here. I noticed also Belarus, you find the opposite quadrant. I noticed Belarus came quite low on the authoritarian notion of democracy. But you probably also find it would come quite low on a liberal notion of democracy. So you have another quadrant there. So you have these four quadrants. So that's it.
This is a good suggestion. In fact,
May I just add something directly to what Roberto was saying? You now also have something quite going on like this in the United States, where some of the supporters of Ted Cruz want to take some of the Christian fundamentalist things, make them into law. The Tennessee legislature last week just declared the Tennessee state book. And the governor vetoed it because he thought that was not, it was an insult to the Bible to sort of make it sort of like any other book. So you have this trend in the United States as well as elsewhere, where there is people want to be democratic until they take control, and then they establish their own rules.
Would you like to answer?
Yes, of course. So thanks for this suggestion. The two-axis idea. In fact, if you look at the result of the dimensional analyses, you would see that you get a two-factor solution, in which you have on the first principal component, you have a bipolar dimension where these liberal, accurate notions of democracy or procedural notions of democracy are one extreme end, and the authoritarian are at the opposite end. And so that speaks to the suggestion to build a summary indicator that balances those two things against each other, which I actually did in my book, where I measured liberal notions of democracy by measuring the liberal notions of democracy minus subtracting authoritarian ones, so taking both of them into consideration. The second dimension, by the way, is redistributive justice kinds of things. But anyways, what drove me away from that, looking at the liberal and the authoritarian kind of in juxtaposition, was the fact that this glosses over another phenomenon, namely that most of the variation, most of the differences of the dissent is on these authoritarian items. The liberal items are almost uniformly consensually supported. For which reason, country differences in liberal understandings on democracy do not map on existing regime differences. But differences in these authoritarian notions do map on regime differences to a much larger extent than the liberal notions of democracy. And therefore, we thought it is really worthwhile to focus on these authoritarian notions specifically, and disconsider for now the alternative notion. So this was the main reason for moving away from this juxtaposition. And this is also actually the strength of the World Value Survey compared to the ESS, because they only ask about these liberal things. And this is not the acid test of democracy. The acid test is whether you support these things that are inherently in a contradiction to these procedural and liberal understandings. And of course, talking about misunderstandings is a normative thing, no question, but democracy is a normative concept. And when you have a theoretical yardstick, it can happen that a respondent looks like on the wrong place compared to that, relative to that yardstick.
Thank you, Chris. I really liked his work, and I'm sure that, I hope it will give you a lot of satisfaction. I really have a suggestion. You've been focusing on the first moment of the distribution, is on the mean. Why don't you also consider, for instance, the standard deviation of authoritarian democracy notions? Because countries are just not homogeneous, and there might be also among, let's say, the first tier, a lot of within-country heterogeneity in this sense. This becomes very relevant if you relabel your democratic equilibrium chart as a democratic loop, because indeed you correctly pointed it as because you are in a cross-section, but there is also an equilibrium that might change, and within country inequalities of authoritarian democracy notions might start a loop that leads a country toward more or less authoritarian interpretation. This might lead to you to some conclusions in terms of where a country will be going in the near future.
That's a good suggestion, looking at distributional features, which we haven't done so far. And also like cohort patterns and stuff like this. Yeah, that's a good suggestion. Thanks.
Chris, as it shows, the Muslim domination is an important variable. On the other side, it sounds politically like, kind of ethnocentric, right? We take on one religion. So I was thinking how to make it more culturally relativist. Like in the upper part of this range, you have Thailand, where over 90% of the population are Theravada Buddhist, and there was a movement until recently to make it a state religion. Only Queen said, no, let's take it separately from the state, like at least officially. And in Armenia, the Orthodox Church is the most trusted institution among youth. And in Georgia, it's the most trusted institution throughout the country, with over 95% of the people supporting its actions. And some research shows that it's the most influential institution in the country. So at least Orthodox Christianity and Theravada Buddhists might also contribute to a kind of religious domination. So do you see it worthwhile to extend this Muslim domination variable to, let's say, religious institution variable?
Yeah, I perfectly agree with that, and this is why we find that Muslim denomination is insignificant in the regression. This is actually exactly supporting your point. It's not about that religious tradition that creates the problem. That's what our findings show. So I would agree with that point.
Anna?
Thanks, Chris. That was very much up to date. I'm looking forward to the publication to refer to. I have one small comment and one question to you. Well, my comment is about your contradictory answers measure, where you compared how important politics is and are you interested in politics. I would say that despite the fact that this measure does not turn again in your analysis or in this presentation, I would say that this kind of measure is, democratically biased. Because in authoritarian societies, you may pretty well say, yes, politics is very important, ideology is very important, but I should rather, stick clear away from that. And this is very authoritarian way of dealing with that, because, this popular notion that authoritarianism is where you are allowed to do anything but politics. But still, I would say that this measure might not work because it is kind of spurred with the notion of authoritarianism. I don't know whether you agree with that. And I wonder how maybe you do have an explanation of this reverse quadratic dependence between the enlightenment and this when you show that in these more enlightened countries the effect of emancipatory values is even stronger on authoritarianism. Do you have any explanation why this is not linear or what? Maybe this quadratic thing has something behind which could be explained in substantive terms? Thanks.
I wouldn't put too much emphasis on the non-linear shape of the distribution, because the quadratic function is driven by a handful of countries. If you remove them, it turns into a linear distribution. So I wouldn't put too much emphasis on the quadratic component. The key thing, the key point is the direction of the relationship, namely that it is negative. That's the key point, and that you get either with a quadratic or a linear fit. You get a negative relation from that interaction. The contradiction measure, yes, logically it is possible to make this compatible, but we do know how people work in an interview situation. People react knee-jerk-wise to a stimulus that is given. They are not making very sophisticated cognitive reflections on the phrasing with which they confront it. People getting an immediate sort of intuitive kind of reaction, and this is what you get in the interview situation. From that point of view, someone says this, but the opposite thing in another question on the same response format, in my eyes, is an indication for this might be non-attitudes here. Also, because I did look into whether the incidence of these supposedly contradictory responses relates to, we have this one question, how interested was the interviewee in the interview situation, and this is pretty closely related to each other, which is at least face validity to maybe these are respondents who just give some random answers. The reason why this doesn't show up, however, as a very strong explanatory factor might point to another thing that we know from decades of survey research, that oftentimes random response is randomly distributed, which means that negative and positive deviations cancel each other out, and then they cannot have an effect.
Are there other questions? I would like to ask a question myself. You put like the whole approach of you present is so to say like very much like static or like conservative, or like you say that you speak about authoritarian equilibrium and democratic equilibrium, but could you say something more about factors that like take countries out of the equilibrium, or perhaps about factors that can actually keep them in? Of course, I'm referring to the case of Poland that is close to my heart, which probably lost the democratic equilibrium to some point. I fear that perhaps mistakes have been made.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is that we only have so far cross-sectional data, so I don't have a longitudinal component I could dig into. So the only surrogate we might have for that would be looking at cohort differences, which is interesting because I've just reviewed a paper on China where the author was showing that over consecutive waves, the evidence was from the Asia barometer. Over consecutive waves of the Asia barometer, you would see that the notions of democracy among the Chinese are now showing a cohort pattern that wasn't there before. To the effect that the younger cohorts now have a Western liberal understanding of the term democracy, and the older generations don't have that. And in the previous surveys, that was not the case. And the author interprets this as emerging signs of an emerging, evolving illegitimacy of the current regime, at least in certain population, among certain population segments. Stuff like this could be done. I mean, the key factor is the enlightenment. So if you increase education, if you increase research and development, if you increase information access and communication technology, these kind of things, according to this model, this is the most promising route. Unfortunately, as always, or as so often, also related to Timo Kuran's talk yesterday, this is drilling a very thick board. So it's a long shot, and there is no quick fix to these kinds of things because they are sort of encultured, and culture is a phenomenon that you cannot change overnight.
If there are no other questions, then I think we can finish this session. Thank you very much.
Thank you.